If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. For more videos like this. Who work at cemeteries and graveyards, what strange and scary stuff have you witnessed? I worked for a county cemetery department years ago. We would go to all the cemeteries in the county and mow or just do basic upkeep. Occasionally people, mainly farmers, would stumble upon some headstones in a field or a stand of trees, and we would come out and prod the ground with dowel rods to find more headstones and re-establish the cemetery. Soon after I started working there, we got a tip about some headstones a farmer found while clearing out a path through some trees for easier access to his field. It turned out to be the oldest cemetery in the county, dating back to the 1700s. After investigating some of the names on the headstones, it got really creepy. The story is that before the cemetery was there, a schoolhouse stood there. The teachers were a husband and wife. It's not clear on what exactly happened, but the students and the husband and wife all died in the schoolhouse. The information we found kind of made it sound like an illness of some kind, and they were all quarantined in the school until they all died. After that, the school was demolished and the students and husband and wife were all buried right where the school stood. So yeah, I'm sure it's haunted. When I was in college, I worked part-time at a Jewish cemetery in reception/office management. The cemetery was closed from Friday afternoon through Saturday evening for Sabbath. We sometimes stayed a bit later in the office on Friday afternoons to get bills out or checks processed. We heard a loud commotion by the cemetery entrance, which was locked and only staff could get in and out. The office manager went to see what was going on and made me come with her. We went down to the gate to find an older woman, probably around 70, dressed to the nines, begging us to let her in. She kept saying she needed to get back. This was in the suburbs of NJ, so you needed a car to get around, but we didn't see a car or anything. She was just there in this beautiful dress. We couldn't open the gate without the cemetery manager, so we went to go get him. We brought him back to the gate and no one was there. We looked at video footage of the entrance and you could see us, the office manager and me, talking, but there was no one on the other side of the gate. The cemetery manager thought we were trying to trick him. I swear to this day we saw a woman in a fancy dress outside that gate. There were multiple cameras and not a single one picked up anyone on the other side of the gate, and you could see the whole gate. All you could see was us. I don't know if it was a ghost or what. The office manager and I decided not to tell anyone else, but we would mention it to each other every once in a while. I was a tombstone caretaker for a cemetery in rural Georgia, summertime job for a 16-year-old, nothing crazy, just cleaning off the grime of the elements on tombstones, etc. Now, to just put a setting, the cemetery included one building that housed bathrooms for the 5 staff members of this cemetery, a small simple mausoleum, and then other than that, flat earth with tombstones everywhere. The only surroundings were dense forests in the Georgia country. That being said, due to the eerie surroundings, I was always a bit paranoid, plus I watch a lot of scary movies and so on. I know, bad combo. So one night I was doing my rounds, and I had to go into the small mausoleum, had some of the richer families in the areas entombed within, and I had to go in and make sure all was neat and clean. Standards had to be upheld for these uppity folks. So I approached, and right off the bat, something was off. The air was pretty damn cold. During the summer in Georgia, that was odd. There was a light coming from the mausoleum, and as I approached, I heard voices, laughter. Laughter from a child, a little girl. I thought it was simply younger folks maybe. I haven't seen anyone enter or leave the cemetery, and the laughter sounded young. However, as I got closer, the voices and laughter died, like almost instant. I pause. The light, I also noticed, had gone out. I call the lone security officer that does a few rounds on the lot, 'cause I'm not gonna go in alone, and he comes. We will call him Officer Friendly. When Officer Friendly arrives, we both go inside. We see one of the doors to the entombed remains of a young girl, open. Nothing was disturbed within, but it was open, and a doll lay on the stone beneath it. Me and Officer Friendly do a small sweep. It was only 1 floor and 1 room, so it didn't take long. We close the door to the girl's entombment, and we both leave. As we walk away, we get about 30 feet from the mausoleum, and then all of a sudden, boom, voices and laughter again. I jump, and Officer Friendly looks to me, looking pretty shaken, says to me, "You hear it too?" We look back, and boom, lights back, laughter continuing. We don't go back and just book it. I found out the next morning, the door was open again. This time the doll was on the other side of the mausoleum from where we found it the night before. I resigned the next day, in good lol. My mom and stepdad were the caretakers of a small cemetery for about 10 years. All of us kids, 6 between the two of them, helped out at one point or another. One summer I was helping my mom with mowing and upkeep. It was a super hot summer, so we would try to go and get the mowing done early before the heat became too unbearable. Well, we had trouble getting the truck going one day. so we ended up starting a little later than usual and were unable to finish up everything that day. My mom had an appointment the next morning and the day after that it was supposed to rain, so I told her I would go up early the next morning and finish up the trimming with the weed eater. So, it's about 7 in the morning and I am listening to music with my headphones and going around the headstones. Everything was going well until I got to the oldest section of the cemetery. That part was on a small slope of a hill. Once you got to the bottom and looked up you couldn't see the road, but you could see it again once you were about halfway up. When I finished up the last headstone, I turned off my equipment and started back up the hill. I glanced up in time to see a little girl in a pretty red dress. She was running and disappeared behind a large headstone. I figured her parents were visiting another grave and the little girl ran off to entertain herself. It was around 9 a.m. at this point. I got to the top of the hill and there was no car or people around. The cemetery wasn't really close to any houses, and the girl was too nicely dressed to have walked out there. I looked around and shouted for her to come out. I was able to see the headstone she ran behind, and I would have seen her if she ran out again. I couldn't find her anywhere. I called my mom and told her what was going on and asked if I should call the police and tell them about this little girl. She looked to be about 3 or 4 years old, so she certainly shouldn't be by herself. My mom asked me if she was wearing a red dress. I said yes. Why? So, she proceeds to nonchalantly tell me that was just the ghost girl. Now, everyone who knows me knows that I don't fuck with ghosts. I asked why she didn't tell me there was a ghost in the cemetery. She said she needed my help and was afraid I wouldn't go up if Elle thought it was haunted. Now granted, I probably would have been more leery of the place, but knowing no one else could help her, I would have still helped her that summer, but I would have made sure I wasn't there by myself. I still go there sometimes as I have relatives buried there, but I am always with someone. Fortunately, I never saw any other ghosts and I have never seen the little ghost girl ever again. I don't work in either, but this story is about a court case that was featured on one of those small claims shows I think. A few small details I don't remember exactly, but this sticks in my mind. Basically this woman had her mother buried and was deep in grief. Then the area where she was buried got flooded and her mother's casket came up out of the ground. If I remember, the funeral people were claiming act of God, but don't quote me on that. The daughter was horrified to find out what happened, as anyone would be, but understandably was almost in hysterics because her mother feared drowning and the cause of her mother's death was water in the lungs. The other news story I read was about a family who found out the ashes they were given were only cement, and there was this huge investigation launched, but it was such a hard thing to piece together because they couldn't tell what belongs to who. Turns out that there had been other complaints, including one family who had remains including remnants of a watch and jewelry. The deceased had none on. The worst part of the whole thing, the funeral director had a connected business that donates body parts. It was in Colorado if you want to Google it. Not really a cemetery experience, but it was still pretty freaky. My grandparents live out in the middle of nowhere pretty much and is surrounded by woods. On their property, there was a whole family that owned my grandparents' property before them. From what I was told, they were killed or something like that. A few years ago, when I was still living with my grandparents, a relative that was related to the dead family came up to the property and wanted to remove the bodies from the land. My grandpa was extremely happy about it because he wanted to expand the house but couldn't because he didn't want to mess with the graves. So they got together and I stood nearby, watching them dig up 4 caskets. There were 3 adult-sized caskets and 1 child-sized casket. And they all looked really old. One of the bigger caskets had holes and cracks all over it. That was the one that my grandpa and the other relative was carrying when the body fell out the bottom of the casket. The body was pretty much bones, but it still had old muscle and tissue on it. I remember feeling sick to my stomach as I watched them uncomfortably put the body back into the casket upside down. Former funeral director here. My partner and I had just gotten back to the funeral home from a house call for a 31-year-old woman who died of cancer. As we were moving her body from the cot to embalming table, we heard an audible click and the radio across the room turned on full volume of static. It's one of those old radios you turn the volume dial until it clicks to turn it on. We both looked at each other. He was an extremely religious man and this event visibly shook him, and he left not long after the incident. I shut the radio off as I typically used my phone to listen to music while embalming. When I'd finished the procedure and was attempting to move her from the embalming table to a dressing table, I heard that click from that old radio and it turned on full volume yet again. At that point I was fairly freaked out and made my exit not long after. My partner and I never spoke of it again, and nothing like that ever occurred to my knowledge before or after. I used to do some odd jobs at the 12th century graveyard in my hometown. 12th century, as in the church and its surrounding graveyard, had been in continuous use for at least that long. When you keep burying bodies in the same small patch of ground for that many centuries, eventually the soil has been turned over dozens of times and consists mainly of bone fragments. You can't even plant flowers there without accidentally uncovering some teeth or finger bones or something. It's nothing but fragmented skeletons all the way down under the thin turf. The soil sort of resembles seaside shell sand, except on closer examination all the light-colored bits are bone fragments rather than crushed seashells. Not really scary or unexpected, just a bit eerie until you get used to it. You learn to treat anything recognizable as human remains with respect, and just tuck it away out of sight under the plant or whatever else you were putting there. My dad purchased a cemetery when I was in middle school, and I worked for him through high school graduation. I did yard work, mowing, weed eating, flower beds, etc. Aside from the occasional shadows seen out of the corner of my eye, seeing people who turned out to not be there, and hearing strange sounds, the cemetery was actually a quite peaceful place. But the strangest is when you have a burial in the crypts. Basically, you dig down about 4 or 5 feet to expose giant cement doors. You pull the cement doors off and drop down into a little room. These rooms can fit 2 coffins, or years and years and years worth of cremated remains. So back in the 50s and 60s, families would buy one crypt and the entire fam would be cremated and put in it. Some just put the cremated remains in it and close her up, but others light candles and leave flowers and souvenirs and pictures and shit. It's fucking creepy opening up one of those bad boys after 50 years and finding melted candles and old pictures of the people inside. Plus when you hop down in there you have a weird realization that you are at the same level and completely surrounded by bodies. I used to work as a park ranger in a cemetery in London which has been converted into a nature reserve. It's in a very ghetto area the local kids nicknamed it the Forest. Regularly we'd find ammunition, knives and occasionally pistols hidden in the memorials/gravestones and the police would be called to collect them. A friend once found a backpack full of Molotov cocktails prepared. I never saw a pistol myself. Only once I had the honor of finding something. I found a plastic bag stuffed behind a collapsed monument and inside it had a load of shotgun shells. It was terrifying for me because you have no idea if someone is watching you or aware that you've just found their stash. The police come, you have to show them where it is and that further highlights your involvement to any of the local kids watching you. That particular park people avoid as soon as the sun goes down. I take care of a small family mausoleum. The family that is buried there has no living descendants, so it falls to me to clean out the facility and replace the flowers inside the building. I also make sure that there's no damage to the mausoleum. I've become very acquainted with the family that is buried inside. One day, as I was closing up my office, my phone rang and when I answered it there was a very agitated woman on the other end. She was very clearly under the influence of something. She asked me repeatedly if I knew where Jane Smith was. Jane Smith has been buried in the mausoleum since the early 1900s. I asked her why she needed to know. The woman very calmly asked me to go to the mausoleum to double check that Jane was still there because she believed that she was her. I assured her that I was pretty sure Jane was still peacefully buried and our phone conversation ended a few moments later. Drugs and alcohol are a hell of a thing, but it still creeped me out enough that I don't answer my phone after 5 p.m. any longer and I make sure someone is with me when I go to the cemetery. My dad was a cemetery superintendent, so we were in residence there from the time I started high school. I lived there with my parents for about 5 years. My dad worked in the same cemetery, and lived there for 35 years. There's nothing strange or scary in a cemetery, they can actually be very peaceful, idyllic places. Anything that would be strange or scary is brought there by your own preconceptions and expectations. You can stretch the symbols of old worn tombstones, the shapes of trees in the seasons, the mists and fogs of weather, to scare yourself. It was human, very much alive, agency that was scary. It was 160 acres in the middle of the city. Tons of kids roamed that place at night. They drank and fucked all over the place. They also committed acts of vandalism. One night, a group went through and knocked over 160+ tombstones. I used to work as a receptionist in a funeral home. One busy Saturday everyone left to go to the cemetery with a family for the graveside service, except for the one embalmer who was downstairs working. I was doing paperwork when my phone rang and it was someone calling the internal line from the prep room, where the embalmer was. I answered and I could hear the radio clearly playing in the background but nobody was on the line. I walked 10 feet into the office beside mine and the embalmer was sitting at the computer working on something. I asked her who was downstairs in the prep room and she looked at me funny and said there's nobody down there. They all went to the cemetery. She was right. There was no one else in the building. I don't believe in spirits or anything of the sort, but that certainly creeped me out. I spend lots of time in a local cemetery. The weirdest thing there to me is this small section located a little bit off to the side that's filled with many very old graves marked only by numbers. I'm not sure how many there are exactly, but I've seen the numbers go up past 300 ERK. Some of them have little flags by them, indicating that they're a veteran, however, no name or dates accompany the number. I never really figured out why they were just numbered and had no identity. In the same area there's a grave that has no number but does have a name, dates of birth and death, and birthplace, but it's entirely in Greek. Reading it reveals that they were born in Leucadia, Greece, and they share a last name and birthplace with another entirely Greek grave located all the way across the cemetery. Not necessarily creepy, but I thought it was interesting. I wonder why they weren't buried closer together if they're related. There was also a grave in one of the newer sections that had a note posted next to it from the wife of the man buried there, angry that some lowlife had stolen the flowers she had left by his grave. Seeing this made me angry as well, so I picked some flowers from my yard and left them there with my own note explaining that the idea of stealing flowers from a grave broke my heart and I'm sorry that someone would do such a thing. I wonder if she ever saw it. I hope it wasn't out of line for me to do that. Also, I have seen things and felt things in my presence while I walked alone between graves. Nothing too serious, just movement out of the corner of my eyes and feeling like I'm not alone when truly I'm the only one around in that area. I'm not entirely sure if I believe in ghosts or not, but if they are ghosts, I hope they don't mind me hanging around so often. I really enjoy the peace and quiet of the cemetery, as well as the beautiful monuments and interesting history you can find there. Sorry that this comment was so long and the stories may not be quite as strange or scary as others may have, but I wanted to chime in because I have a passion for cemeteries in general. Somewhat related. I didn't work in a graveyard or cemetery. But I ran marketing and business development for a manufacturer in high-end electronics in the luxury market. In servicing this high-end market, we had customer support that matches the expectations that buyers, or more importantly, the systems integrators, expect. We had a particular end-user customer that had been having some failures of our equipment. Things just stopped working. While equipment failures are not uncommon, having several failures is not the norm, as the failure rates are usually around 2 to 3% across the industry. One day, one of our sales reps was doing a visit to all the resellers/integrators in the area, and visited the house, or rather mansion, to do a quick inspection. Part of the reason was that the integrator wanted us to look at the setup, and the other reason was to implicitly imply that something was wrong with our equipment, assuming the install and configuration was done correctly by the integrator. Our sales rep goes to the home, and learns that it is not just our equipment that was failing, but that other electronics in the home had issues as well. She found out that the home had significant electrical surges. And she also learned that the home was built on top of an old Indian burial ground. We stopped being so generous with warranty claims for this customer after that. My boyfriend is a gravedigger/caretaker of an old cemetery right by us. Besides seeing the typical disappearing person here and there, he doesn't really have stories. However, I think the way he got that job is amazing. Before working at the cemetery, my boyfriend quit his farming job of nearly 25 years. That left him unemployed for a few months and kind of lost as a person who likes to have goals and such. Anyway, one night I decide we should go to that cemetery with a recorder and ask if there is life after death. The aim was to get a recording of a voice or a sign in some way. Boyfriend seemed pretty cool with it, until about 5 minutes after we started walking through the cemetery. First thing I noticed was my boyfriend had taken his hat off and was holding it over his heart with a worried look on his face while I was holding the recorder and giving our initial greetings to any potential spirits listening. I said to the spirits, "I hope we're not being disrespectful by being here. We don't mean any harm. I only have one question and then we'll leave." I then ask, while my boyfriend is silent the entire time, if there is life after death. Because I didn't hear anything, I pushed it a bit, asking repeatedly. I had just decided to ask for a sign, blinking lights, when my boyfriend finally spoke, saying, "I think we should have respect and leave now." His eyes were watery. I could tell he was having strong feelings about it, so we left. I did review the video later that night and discovered that although I couldn't see lights blinking while we were there, on the video they twinkled like stars. And that was that. Until 2 days later my boyfriend gets a call, he knows everybody, offering him a job at the cemetery. After our initial surprise I said, "You'd honestly be a perfect person to work there. You clearly have respect for the dead." It's been about 4 years now. My boyfriend is the guy who stands with respect throughout a burial gathering with the family and waits until he thinks everyone is truly ready for the lowering of the casket. I worked all last summer for a small town. Part of my job was going out and weed whacking and mowing the cemetery once a week, meaning I spent 8 to 16 hours a week out there depending on what needed to be done. There was a man out there who would show up right beside the same grave every time I was on the lawn mower. Every day without fail his shadow would appear in the middle of the field beside the same grave in the middle of a treeless section of the cemetery. I think he was just a lonely spirit on the way to the next life. After I quit, I was packing up to move back to college and I was standing in the middle of a bedroom in the basement holding an Actifry. The thing turns on and beeps and runs for about 30 seconds. And I'm holding the cord end standing in the middle of the room. I think he realized I wasn't coming back and decided to mess with me a bit, honestly. A lot of the old guys from town were known to be pranksters. The only other thing I can think of is the squirrel carcasses that would appear. I think it might have been a hawk, but every few days without fail there would be about 4 to 5 new rodent carcasses, funny skinned like a hunter had skinned them under an old dead tree. That I think freaked me out the most. I live in a large European city and there is a graveyard, close to where I live, that is a few hundred years old. A few famous people from the past are buried there. However, there is a grave with a big crypt on it. This crypt has no name and isn't like your typical crypt. It's made up of a statue in front of a curved wall, that arches over the statue a bit. The statue itself depicts a Virgin Mary-like woman, who holds a human heart in her hand like you would a cross while praying. The whole crypt is made of a beautiful white marble, and it has these chaotic pitch black lines running across it. The wall behind the statue makes me shiver in a fascinating, eerie way. The wall is covered with fine gold inlays, that depict an all-seeing eye, within a pyramid that is held by hand reaching from a golden cloud above. The all-seeing eye is emitting golden rays falling upon a valley in which a small version of our planet is sitting just above a river, with mountains on each side. If we then look at the statue in front of it again, we will notice that there's a cylindrical hole going through the heart, in which a triangle is set, with a golden all-seeing eye engraved on all sides. Dan Brown would have a good time trying to decipher this one. I grew up next to one my entire life. My grandfather and uncles have mowed it and been on the board of trustees that managed the place my whole life. The most unexplainable thing happened before I was old enough to mow there, aged 9 or so. I remember one winter it was snowy and very cold, but for 3 days a casket was left sitting next to a gravestone for the space of like 3 days or something and finally got lowered into the ground after that. Not sure if it was the cold/snow made it impossible to dig, dirt might have collapsed from the side after the hole was dug, and had to wait for the weather to break? Not sure, but I 100% remember the casket on the hillside for a couple days. The second most unexplainable thing, and the freakiest, is the storage shed on the edge of the cemetery. There's windows on the side to look in, mostly ladders, folding chairs, landscaping equipment. However, in the rafters every year there are dead snakes hanging from them. I cannot for the life of me figure out how they get up there, let alone how they stay in there and die. I can see how they get inside from the wooden door gaps but not up in the rafters on top. My uncle never goes in the shed for that reason, it stays locked and never gets used. I found a Boy's Life Boy Scout magazine from the 70s that disintegrated as I picked it up laying in there. So it definitely never gets used aside from the time they let me look inside it. I also wonder how the snake's bones/skin don't stay up in the rafters because no one goes in there to clean them out. I imagine mice, rats, or something eat the remains. My friend died in a car accident when he was 22. I had to leave university and return to my hometown to attend his funeral. When it was almost the time to lower him in the grave, we all stood around waiting. And then there was a white butterfly flying around. Nothing unusual for spring, but that butterfly was flying really close to all of our faces, like touching us and then flying away. We all noticed it. Then I go back to the university and meet with my sisters and one of their friend. This particular friend was known to feel things that will or had happened. I was always skeptical about her abilities. So we all talk, and kinda tell sad stories about the deceased. And this girl suddenly tells us, "Do you know that, sometimes souls are in a form of white butterflies before leaving the earth?" My hair stood up, I'll never forget the feeling, I was in shock. I proceeded to tell them about the butterfly I saw, and she was like, "Yep, that was your friend." I still don't believe in stuff like that, but this case. I really want to believe that that was how my friend told his goodbye to us. I work construction in a cemetery now and for the past 6 months and haven't experienced anything but I did about 10 years ago. My ex and I went to visit Wyatt Earp's grave because I'm a huge fan of the Old West. My ex used to work on one of those paranormal TV shows and is big into that field, so she had her voice recorder with her when we went. We got there in the late afternoon on a Saturday. There was nobody in sight other than a couple of guys doing landscaping off in the distance. After visiting the Wyatt Earp grave we saw another elaborate one nearby. It had those laugh now cry later clown mask designs on it. We googled the name of the person buried there and he was some old Russian actor. She pulled out her recorder and started asking questions. It began to get dark and the cemetery was closing, so we started our hour-long drive home. In the car she plays her voice recorder. Nothing while at the Wyatt Earp grave, but when we got to the actor's grave she asked, "Is there anyone here with us that would like to communicate?" Clear as day you can hear a woman's voice say yes. Now it wasn't my ex because I was standing right next to her when she asked that, and it wasn't another live woman because there wasn't one anywhere in the cemetery. We never figured out what said yes. I lived next to a cemetery, like, my backyard and the cemetery had half a fence dividing the two. I used to walk out there at night when I couldn't sleep and go get stoned. I was in a real dark place in my life, very depressed. It was one of the oldest graveyards in our town. It had all kinds of graves from the early 1800s. Lots of newborn graves. There was one grave I liked, because it had a stone bench kind of connecting the two. It was one of the older graves. It was kind of far in and wasn't the best place to sit. It was run down, but I liked it for some reason. It always called out to me as good place to sit and smoke. Like, it was just a weird feeling I had. When I'd sit there the wind wouldn't make me cold, my feet would be warm, and critters would start to stir. The raccoons would come check me out, crows would lay up and caw at me, coyotes would cross the creek and take a lap. Like, it was just a weird little spot. One night I read the headstones. It had belonged to a young husband and wife in their 20s, around my age at the time, that died less than a week apart. She had killed herself in grief after her husband had been murdered. It just struck me funny. Like, it's hard to explain the vibe, but that spot had just called out to me for a while, and it kind of shook me that it happened to be the most brutal one in the whole place. After that I'd always bring a little something for them on my midnight walks. I even said bye when I moved out of that house. When I was young, my family and I used to go to the cemetery my great-grandparents, Dad's grandparents, were buried in, and my mum mentions the time I fell in their grave on the day of my great-grandmother's burial. She died in 1993 and her husband in 1952, so I would have fallen in top of my great-grandfather, who has been buried over 40 years by then. I was only 3.5 at the time and still remember falling in and screaming to be rescued. An unrelated incident in the same cemetery was when my dad accidentally stepped on a grave, and my mother said it was bad luck stepping on the dead. My dad laughed it off nonchalantly and ended up calling time on visiting the family graves, and we went back to the car park. Then Dad ended up losing his car keys and wallet that were deep in his jeans back pocket. He's super stringent about cards and car keys, so he can't think on how both things went missing, especially when he had them when we got to the cemetery. We ended up looking around the graves and following our last steps and areas we had been, naturally the family graves, and found nothing. Mum then jokes Dad's wallet and keys are probably on the grave Dad stepped on, so Dad, who by then was hysterical with panic and exasperation, ran back to said grave and found both wallet and keys directly next to each other on top of the grave. Dad thought we played a practical joke on him, but we were adamant we had nothing to do with it. And we argued on how could we extract a wallet and keys from the depths of his jeans pocket without him noticing. My sister and I were actually freaked out about it. It was probably a creepy coincidence, but still really odd. Another story, but not relating to a cemetery. The same great-grandmother I mentioned in the first story was seen as a ghost at her daughter's old house, so my great-aunt, my dad's cousin's wife, saw my great-grandmother clear as day looking at her through the window. It was even more poignant as my great-aunt had died in 1997, only 4 years after her mother died, and her husband, my great-uncle, had also seen my great-grandmother in the house too. Don't know if he had seen his wife there too though. A few times I used to visit the above-mentioned cemetery with a couple of friends when I was still in primary school between 2002 and 2003. Because morbid curiosity and I like doing genealogy type stuff, still do, and have located a few family members' family information and graves doing research. Anyway, it's an old cemetery going back to the 19th century, so it has really old graves and covers 10 hectares of land, so there's a lot to explore, like war graves, victims of the influenza pandemic, military graves, and mausoleums. As a side note, as of today the cemetery is now at capacity, 27,867 interments, and our city council is only accepting ash burials or burials for pre-existing plots there. The earthquakes our city had in 2011 and 2013 has severely damaged a lot of the graves, unfortunately too. Luckily my family graves fared okay. Anyway, back to the story. On one occasion my mates and I went to the section with the older graves going back as far as 1918. A lot of the tombstones and monuments had collapsed or were badly cracked, so we couldn't get much information from them. Some of the engraved words had been completely weathered away, but the granite ones remained in good condition and we could decipher the names and dates of some of the gravestones. All of a sudden, inexplicably, as we went past a row of graves, we felt this sudden shift in temperature and atmosphere. It's really hard to explain, but it was so poignant I can still recall the eerie feeling that came over us. One of my friends started crying. She did do this often and for no reason, but in this case it was suitable, and my other mate was like, let's go, and was really freaked out. I didn't need telling twice, and we all booked it out of one of the entrances onto one of the residential streets, breathing hard and heart pounding. I can't remember the conversation or the dialogue that followed, but I can imagine it went along the lines of WTF was that, and what did we just experience? As 11 to 12-year-olds at the time, it was terrifying. We didn't go back after that experience. Even going now an adult brings that uneasy memory back. Fast forward to a few years later, and I am still in contact with both of my friends from primary school. We happened to mention that day in the cemetery, and my friend said something that scared the shit out of me and didn't know at the time. If I did, I would have had nightmares. She says to me that she just didn't get a bad feeling, she actually saw something glide by the row of graves we just went past. It was completely black, like a cape-like figure, and it turned to grin with an awful wide-like smile. Whatever it was, she said, was evil and not human. Not a cemetery worker, but events happened at cemeteries. A girl I was friends with in high school got in a bad relationship with a paranoid schizophrenic. His brother was the same. They all lived in an apartment together. He, the boyfriend, would tell her he wanted to start a family. This meant he would dig up a baby and play house. His threats seemed like he would play them out because he and brother had a large stone headstone as decoration in the apartment that they had stolen. These two guys were big and strong. She was scared of him and didn't know how to safely get out of the relationship. One day, she came home late from work, peeled the blanket back, and on top of her pillow was a tiny human hand. She got out. Later, because I kept track of him, he was doing more stuff in the cemetery, but now with new girls that were into it. They had dug up the body of the poor baby and stomped it in, breaking the stone plaque that covered her. They also dug up an elderly man, and one of the girls kept the top half in her bedroom for fun. Yes, that kind of fun. Another kid witnessed him eating out a female decedent. He looked at him and said something about how it tasted so good, with what he described as black gore running down his chin. It seems like he was eating while performing oral sex. The kid threw up right then. I was quick enough to keep it off my shoes. With him as a witness, I felt there was enough to go to the cops. They were eager to solve this because it was like a new shit show at the cemeteries all the time. The kid was terrified and told them in denial, but they knew he was lying because they had seen the aftermath. He said he just overheard it from someone he can't ID and hadn't seen since. I'm like, BS, cause he freaking threw up. Well, those guys were pretty untouchable. Then their mom won the lottery, over $1 million. They moved home with her and went off the radar for a while. One night, when I was working downtown, outside on a cigarette break, and my friend's ex walks up, sits, and had a smoke as well. He didn't recognize me, but he smelled so bitter. That is when I realized that what I heard about paranoid schizophrenics was true. They have a distinct, bitter body odor. He left after he finished his smoke, and I was freaked out. Last time I saw one of the brothers was over 10 years after everything, just walking down the middle of a busy road. I worked at a cemetery for the span of 4 months during my college years as a way to both pass the time and to make ends meet. It was more serving for the former than the latter. Didn't make great money at $15 per hour working the literal graveyard shift for 4 hours. $60 was good money to eat with, don't get me wrong. I mean, I wasn't eating like a king or anything, but I had my pick of the litter, so to speak, at the meat market. Funny thing about meat markets, all the good stuff usually sits on the shelves, but the decrepit mush usually gets sold right away. Ate pretty well now that I think about it. Anyway, on to the juicy stuff. One night while doing monotonous work around the tombstones and debris, I came across what appeared to be a tiny spot in the grass. Not just any spot, but an odd-shaped and colored one. It was a color that was very difficult to describe. I mean, people say that it's impossible to imagine a new color, but this was definitely like something I have never seen before. Very hard to come up with anything close that does what I saw any sort of justice. It was very unusual, but not to make the story drag, take my word for it, you have never seen anything like it. It enamored me and drew my attention. I looked ever so slightly close enough to make out a small engraving underneath the spot. Big bold letters caught my eye from a keen distance. Could never mistake what I saw. An alarming string of words that still echo to this day. What was it, you ask? A declaration of sorts, and it said. Should have used a serious tag. In the 90s I worked for a few months in Western Angola as part of a crew opening mass graves. I guess that counts. One of the graves was outside an abandoned village, and in it we found over 500 bodies. Usually, we found a few, maybe half a dozen men. Here we found women and children, babies. They'd been in the ground maybe 6 months. There was only bones and clothes. We didn't exhume the bodies, the goal was to make a census. So after we counted the skulls, we closed the grave back up. Our trucks were on the other side of the village, and so I was walking back with my crew through the village, which wasn't burnt like they usually were, just empty, and suddenly there was a little boy standing in the road in front of us. Maybe 2 years old. No one saw where he came from, but he stood there and stared at us with his large eyes. We stopped, because there was no way a child was still alive in this place. The fields were dead and overgrown. There was not another living being for hundreds of miles around. Angola is a huge country and got very empty in those decades of civil war. The kid stood there, then turned and walked away, into one of the huts. We went in after him but could not find him, and though we searched the whole place for maybe an hour after, could not find him. It got dark, and we drove back to the town where we were camped. To this day I don't know whether the kid had some hiding place or not, whether he was a ghost, or how on earth he survived. I visited our large, local cemetery a ton when I was a teenager and started to feel a certain amount of ownership, as one does with locations one visits often, so when a microburst occurred over town one crazy, spring morning, I visited immediately to help with cleanup. There were a few other volunteers out there. Since the Parks Department does most of the tending of the graveyard, it's essentially a historic site, given the famous and important people buried there, and they had to do emergency cleanup elsewhere. Many citizens stepped up to do their part. We worked well into the day, and I stayed as it got dark. Then these kids showed up and started spraying paint on some of the headstones. These little bastards who were part of a local gang in the north of town were just riding away. So I pulled some fallen cedar branches on myself, and moved slowly towards them in the waning light. Some of the kids started getting paranoid when they heard my approach amongst the other night sounds. One even kept looking over at the trees I'd hide behind. I got to within 20 feet or so, tore out from underneath the shadows of the trees, this huge figure all in black covered in tree detritus, and raced towards them, bellowing. They ran away, screaming and scared shitless, and I took some solvent to the cemetery the next day to clean up their mess. I spent a summer tending a small town cemetery. Edging stones with a weed whacker was most of it. Also clearing off old decorations, cutting down bushes and burning them, checking on the big burn pit, this big area behind the cemetery, where anyone in town could burn brush and the like. Anyway, one time I was really hungover. It was 8 a.m., already fucking hot, and I was just miserable. And then I had to shit. Urgently. I was on the other side of the cemetery from the office and there was no holding it in long enough to walk back to my truck, drive over and poop like a civilized person. I waddled in a panic behind the burn pit, dropped through and took giant hangover dump. Thank everything I had a handkerchief. In the middle of the dump, something really weird happened. A raccoon came out of nowhere and hopped up on a log about 10 feet from me and just watched. I sat there for 10 minutes, squatting and shitting, having a staring contest with this raccoon. When I was done he hopped off and walked away. That's it. I thought it was pretty weird at the time. I don't know if you can classify what I did as me being a cemetery worker when I was a teenager. I got a summer job, working with another girl, in our city's bigger cemetery. Our job was to pick up litter, and fake flowers that would get blown away from graves by the wind, basically just tidying up so the groundskeepers didn't have to. That particular cemetery is one of the largest in the Midwest, with lots of paved roads and walkways, and it's popular with tourists, dog walkers, bicyclers, etc., and people will kind of use it as a park because it's very pretty. And people will unfortunately drop litter in there a lot. So one afternoon, the other girl and I were walking the paved roads and there with a trash bag, looking for litter. We came upon a particular area of the cemetery that has a lot of mausoleums, and took the next lane around a corner that goes along the side of one mausoleum. As we rounded it, there was an older gentleman, maybe in his late 60s/early 70s, standing with his back against the side of the mausoleum, just looking at a plot of graves nearby. Now, here's two things that were kind of weird about him. The first thing, he was dressed a bit odd. His clothes were a little out of date, and reminded me of how an older person would dress in the 1950s or 60s, corduroy jacket in like 80-degree weather, and one of those newsboy type caps, long pants, button-up shirt. Just something about the colors and patterns on his jacket, cap, and shirt screamed late 1950s/60s to me. But when you think about it, a lot of elderly people kind of dress in out-of-date clothing anyway, so I shrugged that off. The second thing, he had a coffee mug he was drinking out of. Not a thermos, or a styrofoam cup with a lid, an actual ceramic coffee mug that he was sipping out of. Just right in the middle of the cemetery. As we walked by him, the other girl and I looked at him, and he looked up at us. He smiled, raised the other hand he wasn't holding the coffee mug with, and waved. We waved back, and kept walking. We were only a few feet away when the other girl said that was a little weird, and I said something to the extent of that's what I thought, and we both looked over our shoulders back at him, but he was gone. We stopped, and kind of took a few steps back to see if he'd walked around the mausoleum or something, but we couldn't see him anymore. We both kind of had a what the fuck moment, but we eventually quit looking around for him, and went on with our job. A couple days later, we both showed up for work and went to the building where the groundskeepers kept their equipment to grab a trash bag, and found one of the guys to let him know we were there. We talked to him a few minutes, and I brought up seeing the old man by the mausoleum in the east section. The groundskeeper smiled, and asked did he have a coffee mug. We said yeah. He said yeah, that's our ghost. He's not really there. We pressed for more explanation, and he said he's always seen in that spot, looking at a family plot, and always has a coffee mug. He said there is a grave for the wife, 2 daughters, and the husband. The husband's grave says that he died in the early 70s, and the wife and 2 daughters' graves say they died a couple decades before, and the 3 of them have the exact same date of death, so they assume some kind of accident. They think he was the dad, and that he maybe used to visit his wife and daughter's graves a lot before he died later on. He told us people only see him for a few seconds, then he's gone. Blew our minds.